Okay, so I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Patrice Hopman. I am the Executive Director of Colorado Ovarian Cancer Alliance, and very happy to host you all on this important call. We are joined by Ariel DeFazio. She is COCA's pro bono lawyer and signed up to be of assistance to us on all things employment law. And she's been just a terrific brain trust and support for us as COCA has developed along the way. And she has done these for us before, and we were just talking about we need to do them more often. But she's a great resource, and I'm so, oops, I'm admitting somebody. I'm so bad at the multitasking required in modern days here. So sorry for the distraction. Anyway, Ariel, she practices at Sweeney and Bechtold. And Ariel, why don't you, if I could just pass it on to you, and for you to share a little bit about yourself, and why don't you just also share why the heck did you volunteer to help Coca in the first place?
Sure, gosh,
Then we'll get to the.
think back then. Well, again, my name is Ariel DeFazio. Thanks so much for having me. I am a plaintiff employment attorney in Denver, which means that I represent employees exclusively, except for the occasional helping out of a nonprofit like COCA that's terribly deserving of assistance. So much of my work is representing people who are the victims of discrimination on all sorts of bases, including disability. And so this is a particular area of interest and passion for me because of the kind of plight I've seen clients go through. I think that it is an area that is still very much kind of in the shadows. There's a lot of light that's been shed on, sexual harassment, the Me Too movement, certainly not, 100% corrected, but there's a lot more attention paid to it. But I really do see a huge kind of blind spot here with accommodating individuals with disabilities, especially when those disabilities are not evident, when they're invisible. So I just think it's really important to get the word out about this kind of stuff. And I think I first volunteered with COCA a number of years ago, just kind of looking at their employee handbook and you know, mentioning when new laws would pass and just kind of letting them know about that. But I think a couple of years ago, I said to Patrice, I think it's really important that we could relay information to women and their caregivers about what the landscape looks like with employment law. So once you have a diagnosis, what do you do? Do you disclose it to your employer? How do you navigate that? And she was incredibly receptive, and we did a couple presentations. And so I'm just, you know, I updated this a bit. Obviously we've got the pandemic going on, so that adds a little bit more nuance to some of these areas. And that's just one of the reasons why I'm here today. So thanks for
Well,
having
and I'm just going to jump in and say something I failed to say, just as far as housekeeping,
me. Mhm.
is that what we'll do, we're a small enough group that if you have something that you want to ask a question about, we're both fine with that.
Mhm.
You also can put it into the chat. And at the end of this, we are going to have some Q&A time. So number one, I would promise to read it, or you then yourself can ask it. But so just so you know, we're okay rolling with, I think we're a small enough group that we don't have to force everybody to wait
Yeah,
till Q&A if there's something you wanted a little more information on that Ariel was covering.
that sounds great.
I
Okay.
just also want to say, I don't know why, I want to announce that Ariel had a pandemic baby.
I did.
She's almost one.
Yeah.
So she's been quite a busy
Yeah.
attorney.
She was born on March 9th. So if COVID was a little person, they'd be walking and babbling right around now because that's what she's doing. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and do that Zoom thing and hopefully not mess it up too bad. Let's see. Okay. All right. So everybody see that okay?
No, we did
Okay.
not. We practiced this, you guys, and
Of
it
course
worked
we
just
did.
fine. But this time it didn't switch.
Okay, let's try it now.
There you go.
Working? Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just get this going. So I introduced myself. This is my firm, Sweeney and Bechtold. Like I mentioned, we do representation of plaintiff side work, so employment, representing individuals who've been discriminated against or otherwise treated poorly. I have my subtitles turned on just for purposes of inclusion. If that's distracting to anybody, let me know, but I'm just giving it a shot here. So the goals of today's presentation are really to provide you with some understanding of the legal landscape here. So you get diagnosed, you're going for treatment, maybe you have a recurrence, you have a history of cancer, certainly no matter what. How does that impact you? What are your legal rights? And then just helping you recognize red flags that you might encounter as you navigate through this situation with work. I really do think that most employers try to do the right thing, but sometimes they either just don't know what they don't know, or they may just not care, depending on the employer. But I'm certain that most people are just trying to do the right thing. They just don't quite know what it is that they're obligated to do. So for you to have some idea of what it is that they're obligated to do and obligated to provide you, you'll know when they're failing in that regard, or at least you'll know enough. That's why I call them red flags. It's not necessarily that your employer's doing something blatantly illegal, but maybe they're showing signs that they don't have an appreciation for their obligations of the law. And so I'll give you some ideas towards the end of the presentation of what to do to combat those if you do see them come up. And then, like Patrice said, if you've got questions, feel free to pipe up. Probably I may cover what you have a question about, but feel free to shout it out. So I won't get too technical in this conversation, but I do want you to know just kind of the lay of the land. So there's one major law. The star of the show is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. It just turned 30 this year, which is quite exciting. That's really the predominant law that dictates what employers are supposed to do with employees with disabilities. There's a couple of other laws that are relevant depending on the situation. So if you're in a small employer, if you've got fewer than 15 employees like my firm does or like COCA does, then you fall within the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act. If you're a federal employee, you're covered by the Rehabilitation Act. And really, even if the ADA doesn't apply in those situations, those laws are interpreted very, very similarly. So what I'm going to say really covers all three, no matter which one technically you're covered under. Most folks, it's the ADA, but if it's CADA or the Rehab Act, we're talking about the same stuff. So the really special thing about these laws is that they do two very important things. First, they protect employees from being discriminated against based on their disability. And that's essentially just being treated differently because of your disability. And that includes even having a record of a disability, which is why, hopefully you get treatment for your cancer. It never comes back, but you do forever after have a record of having had cancer. And sometimes employers, if they learn that information, can make judgments that are very unfair or untrue about the liability that you pose or something like that. And so that you are protected on that means, even if you don't actually have cancer continuing. Then there's also a bizarre situation where you might be regarded as having a disability, but you don't actually have one. In that situation, you'd still be protected by the ADA. That's not likely to come up here, but it's just an interesting piece of information. So on the one hand, there's this obligation to not treat people differently. On the other, employers are also required to affirmatively provide reasonable accommodations to qualified employees. That's a really, really powerful tool. And it's something that differentiates these laws from other anti-discrimination laws like Title VII, which protects people from discrimination based on sex and race and religion, among others. So the ADA is really one of the only laws that affirmatively obligates an employer to do something for you. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I have a couple of key resources here at the bottom of the page. The Job Accommodation Network, or JAN, is really outstanding. I cannot, overstate what amazing resources this group has. It's a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Labor and a couple of other entities. They offer free technical assistance, so you can call them and ask questions. There are great brochures and other documents on their website that I'll even refer to in my presentation. So I'd recommend that you take a look there just to kind of browse around and see what what they have to offer. The EEOC is the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and that's the federal agency that's in charge of enforcing anti-discrimination laws like the ADA. And I've got a couple websites here within the EEOC, one that talks about disability discrimination, and then the other talks specifically about the coronavirus and kind of the interesting nuances that has added to these areas of law. It tends to be a bit more technical than the JAN website, but there's still some real valuable information kind of embedded in there. So again, I don't want to get too technical, but there's a few pieces of information that you should know, some legal definitions. What is a disability? It certainly includes ovarian cancer or really any kind of cancer. It's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And a major life activity is, it's overly legalistic. I don't know why they couldn't have written it in clearer English, but it's basically just things that you need to do to function, caring for yourself, hearing, sleeping, walking, lifting, sitting, thinking, concentrating. A lot of those things are impacted by having cancer or getting chemo. And certainly normal cell growth, reproductive functions, all of those things are considered major life activities. And when you're looking at whether a person has a disability, you consider the impact that treatment has on them. So, even if you're perfectly doing fine, but you start getting chemo, and that's actually when you're having maybe executive functioning deficits or trouble concentrating, that's still considered part of your disability. And you have a disability even if it's perfectly controlled. You've got folks with diabetes who take medication, or people with mental health issues that take medication, and they're perfectly controlled and regulated, but they still have a disability technically. A qualified person with a disability is really the most important term, and that means that you can perform the essential functions of your job with or without reasonable accommodations. And that's so important because a qualified person is a person who is entitled to have reasonable accommodations. And that just means, can you do the core aspects of your job? Because that's what an essential function is. My essential functions as an attorney: counseling clients, doing legal research, writing briefs. We work in a really small office, so I water plants, I empty the dishwasher, I greet clients, I answer the phone, I talk to prospective clients sometimes. Those things are not essential parts of my job. I do them kind of peripherally. That's the distinction in trying to figure out what is essential and what's not. And there are different things when you get into court. If you're looking at a lawsuit that has to do with an ADA claim, there are different things that a court will look at when they're trying to figure out, well, what is the essential function? They could look at a job description. I think a lot of us have had experience where we've worked in a job for 5 years and there is no job description, or it hasn't been updated in years. So that's, you have to take that with a grain of salt. There's, what do you actually do on a day-to-day basis? What did a person who was in that job before do on a day-to-day basis? And those are the different things that courts will look at to try and figure out, well, what are the essential functions of this job? Reasonable accommodations are just what will help you do your job. That's not going to be an undue hardship for the employer. And an undue hardship is significant difficulty or expense. So this is not just, oh, it's not convenient, or we don't want to spend the money to get you a special keyboard. That's not good enough. That's not an undue hardship. And we'll talk about that a little bit. You get your diagnosis. What are you going to do? Should you disclose it to your employer? I think that's probably the most prevalent question that people have. And it's a tough decision, but I'd say my general guidance is, if you are concerned that your condition or your treatment is going to at all impact your performance, so whether it's going to impact your attendance, maybe it's going to impact the quality of the work that you're creating, because obviously having cancer and having treatment for it is a tremendously exhaustive experience, and it's going to take a lot of your time and energy, both physically and mentally. And so it's very likely that it will impact your ability to show up to work 100% as you've been doing. So if there's any concern in your mind that that's going to happen, then I think it's worth disclosing it at work. But again, it's a totally personal, and it's job specific and position specific. But the guidance that I give to potential clients or to clients is that, on the one hand, admitting that you need a reasonable accommodation like leave, or maybe a couple of assignments to be given to another employee, anything like that is a very vulnerable place for people to end up, because you've been presumably working a lot of your life. You haven't probably needed any help. And it can be very vulnerable to admit, hey, I need something, I need some help. But on the other hand, you don't get the benefits of the ADA. Your employer is not obligated to give you anything, to give you a reasonable accommodation, unless you disclose that you have a disability. So it's a real catch-22. You can't, take advantage of the law unless your employer knows that you need it. And in the absence of that disclosure, they're not going to really be on the hook to get you anything to help you get through a cancer diagnosis and treatment, and how that may impact your ability to work. So if you have come to the point where you think, okay, I do need to disclose it, I'm going to need accommodations, I'd say that the first step before you even talk to your employer is to get a doctor on board, whether it's your general practitioner or your oncologist, somebody who's going to be responsive and supportive of you. And the ADA, kind of to a fault, is very deferential to people's doctors. And that's, I say to a fault because some doctors don't want to be in charge of figuring out what reasonable accommodations you need at work. They're not, vocational rehab specialists. They have no idea. So I have interacted with some doctors, or with, clients who are dealing with doctors who just don't want to touch it. And I think there's also kind of a general, you know, resistance when you're a medical professional to be involved with anything legal, because it means you're being sued for malpractice, even though that's not remotely what's going on here. But I think there's kind of an automatic distaste for anything legal. So some doctors don't want to sign paperwork. They don't want to, write letters or anything like that. And that's okay, but it's just a really important thing to know, because, of the kind of panel of people you're going to have helping you with your healthcare, you want to make sure you pick the one who's going to be on board, who's going to support you. And I have here a link to a Jan brochure that's really great. And it may be a good thing to send to a doctor who wants to help you, maybe one who's a little bit resistant. It provides a sample letter that they could write on your behalf. So I'd highly recommend passing that along to whoever is going to be in your corner helping. And then you want to start the interactive process. That's another term in the law that it is basically a communication with your employer about your reasonable accommodations. And there's not a lot of rules about what it's supposed to look like, other than it's got to be bilateral. So it comes from the employee and it comes from the employer. It needs to be interactive. It needs to be ongoing, and in good faith. And so you never ever want to be the person who's responsible for the interactive process failing. So if your employer asks you for information, provided that it's an okay request, and we'll talk about that, you want to respond promptly, you want to respond fully, you want to be truthful, and you just never want that ball to be sitting on your side of the court. I think that the trickiest thing is when you need a form filled out by a doctor, get in line. There's, they've got patients to see, forms to fill out. Sometimes that can take a little while. So you do sometimes have to be the squeaky wheel to get things done in order to get paperwork back to your employer if they need it. And then you'll also want to see if you work for a large enough company, there may actually be a policy or, an ADA procedure, a form you need to fill out if you want to get an accommodation. So you want to look in your employee handbook. If there's procedures and policies, look in there. If there's not, you don't need to make up a process. It's just, you're going to send a letter or an email to whoever you need to get the process going. This is a sample of what it could look like. And some of this is pulled, and I know it's kind of dense, but I've underlined the important components of it, and I've cited to a Jan brochure that's a little bit simpler that talks about what should be in this request for an accommodation. And I should say too that your employment situations are going to be different. You may not have to put this stuff in writing. I mean, you're not required to under law by any means. You can just have a conversation with your boss or with an HR person and say, hey, this is what's going on. I was just diagnosed with cancer. I'm going to need time off. I'm going to need X, Y, and Z. And that's okay. That's a perfectly legitimate way to ask for an accommodation. But if you're really trying to, dot your I's and cross your T's and make sure that everything is documented, put it in writing. That's kind of, when in doubt, put it in writing. But there are certainly situations where people work at employers where they're not concerned about this going, unresponded to, and you may not have to do this, and that's okay. So there's just a few components of this that are important. You want to send it to the right person. You know, I'd say also it's situation dependent. You may not feel comfortable disclosing this to a supervisor. There's certainly situations where people have kind of a harried, relationship with their supervisor. They're not so excited about disclosing this to them. I think it's helpful to do so, just because if somebody's rating your work, they should probably know that this is going on with you, that you have this diagnosis and you're going to need time off, and that they should hopefully be a little bit more lenient and understanding. If it gets locked up in HR and your supervisor doesn't know this is what's going on, then they may be judgmental about being late, not coming in. Maybe they're interpreting it as you not being committed to your work, when in fact it's because I have cancer and I need to have treatment. And no, this has nothing to do with my devotion to my job. So I do tend to think that it's helpful to include a supervisor, but it's entirely up to you. Certainly an HR representative, or if there's some, in a large enough company, they may actually be an ADA representative or someone who does accommodations. So that may be the person that you're including there, or maybe it's all three, or a smattering of some of these folks. So you want to identify the fact that you have a diagnosis, that you have a medical condition, you're a person with a disability under one of these laws. I'd like to meet with you to talk about accommodations. Here are some of my ideas. I think I'm going to need leave. I think I'm going to need time off to go to the doctor's appointments. I think that I'll need to return on a part-time basis initially, or whatever it is. You don't have to have everything figured out at that point, but just throwing out a few ideas is helpful. You're open to what the employer might suggest, because they do, the employer does have a right to contribute its ideas as well. And I think just generally you want to come across as open to the process. Just, that's the interactive give and take part of the interactive process. Here are my ideas. What are yours? What do you think is feasible? And you're coming off well, I think, by doing that. And that you're, hoping to hear from them by a certain date. I'd give them maybe a week to get back to you. You don't want to be unreasonable about you've got to respond within 24 hours. It's a little bit much, but certainly putting some kind of deadline on it so that you can have some level of certainty that this process is starting well before you're going to need time off or any other accommodation. Here's just a few examples of accommodations. Really, I think it's an opportunity to be creative. So there may be things, certainly there are things listed that are not listed here that could be helpful, but these are some of the most common. Part-time or modified work, medical leave. The nuance there is that it needs to be for a determined period of time. And of course, when, let's say you decide to go on leave for, some of the time you're getting chemo, let's say, or radiation, or for, to get a surgery and to recover, your doctor can give their best guess. They're not going to know exactly what date you're going to be able to come back. But as long as your doctor gives a good faith estimate, I think it'll be 4 weeks, and then we'll see. It's okay to then follow up with your employer and say, hey, I got an infection, or I'm still not feeling great, or hey, I'm feeling great before, and I think I can come back earlier. That's all fine. It's really just a matter of giving some sort of estimate as to when you'll be able to come back. What's not a reasonable accommodation is, hey, I'm going to head out on leave. I don't know when I'm going to be back. Hang on to my job for me. Thanks. Like that doesn't fly. Your employer could keep your job open for that long, but they don't have to. So I'd say, if you can give a estimate of when you'll be back, great. Obviously, base it on what your doctor recommends, because that's what's most important for you, physically and medically. I'd say working from home, that's a big one now that COVID is so present. And what's kind of interesting about that is, a year ago, before COVID and before everybody, or at least a lot of people were working from home, there was some resistance, I think, on the part of courts to say that work from home was reasonable. And I think that's going to be really difficult now. I mean, there are certainly some jobs that you just cannot do from home, customer service, in, person at a store, being a medical professional. Obviously you have to be in person to do those things, but there are many employers who may have claimed at some point you can't do this from home, and maybe people have been doing those jobs from home, and it's going to be a lot more difficult now that they've had to do that in a pandemic for 8, 9, 10, 12 months to claim now, oh well, you have to be here in person to do that, because the job has been being conducted from home. So I think that more and more folks are going to have more luck pushing for work from home. Uh, and then there's a list here of accommodations that have been found to be unreasonable. So other than an indefinite leave, asking to be excused from some sort of objective criteria, maybe decreasing a sales goal or expectation, those are not reasonable. Again, your employer certainly can do those things for you. The ADA and these laws are a floor, not a ceiling. So if they want to be more generous, that's great, but they don't have to be. Same thing with eliminating an essential function of your job. If there's something that you do that really only you're trained to do, you can see if there's willingness to give it to somebody else, but your employer does technically not have to do that. And then excusing or overlooking misconduct. So this is where I think it's very important to give some serious thought to whether to disclose your disability in the first place. Because if there's going to be issues with, let's say, you don't disclose it and you're late several times because you're, getting treatment and you're sluggish getting out of bed, and then you get written up, it's a lot more difficult kind of on the back end to say, oh, wait, I actually have this condition and I need an accommodation. It would have been a lot better to disclose it on the front end, and then kind of, this whole asking for forgiveness is not a good idea with a disability, because they technically, an employer doesn't have to, take that write up out of your file or, forgive that misconduct if they didn't know that you were maybe going to be having some issues with that performance standard, attendance, or whatever it is. So that's something to think about when you're in that initial, ruminating on whether you should be disclosing it in the first place. When you ask for an accommodation, a lot of times as a matter of policy, or maybe just the employer, that's the first place they go, it may prompt a request from your doctor to support your request for reasonable accommodations. And that's okay, although there's some, parameters about what they should be asking about. So, yes, you can absolutely, somebody from work can ask about, your well-being, how are you? That seems fine. They can ask your doctor for accommodation to substantiate that you have the condition that you claim and that you need the accommodations that you need. That's also fine. That may include, a note or completed paperwork from your doctor. If you're on leave and you weren't quite able to provide a specific date of return, maybe it was an estimate, kind of pinging you every week or two to say, hey, how's it going? Do you think you're coming back? That's okay. It shouldn't be to the point where they're doing it every day, but certainly checking in with you regularly is okay, to just try and figure out when exactly you're coming back. And if your documentation is insufficient in some way, your employer has to tell you why and then give you a chance to provide additional documentation. They're really not allowed to ask for specifics. What medications are you taking? What's your prognosis? What is your treatment going to look like? But then again, these issues are fact dependent. Maybe you're close to the people you work with. Maybe you're friends with your boss, and that isn't such a weird thing for them to ask. At that point, I kind of leave it to your discretion to figure out what it is that it's okay for them to be asking you. But if you're talking about, an HR person you've never met before or you don't know very well, they should not be asking you questions like that. It's not appropriate and it violates the law. And certainly they shouldn't be asking for carte blanche access to your medical records. I've had some clients, have their employer just sign this release. We want to see your medical file. No. That is not something that you get to see. And if you do think you need to see it, you need to tell me why, because I've provided you with the documentation that you were entitled to. And then I have a website at the bottom that talks about, it's a resource from the EEOC that has a guidance materials on, basically what are the parameters of these requests that are okay and what's not okay. And what I like about the EEOC's policy documents is that they'll actually, it'll have some substance, and then it'll give you some examples, and some of them are, they're kind of cheesy examples, but whatever, they're illustrative. So it'll say, this person asks for this time off, their employer says this, is that okay? Yes or no? And then they give you an answer. So I think it can actually be rather helpful. So at this point, what are some red flags that might be arising for you? I'd say any comments about your ability to do your job that are not based on the reality of the situation. The ADA and these laws are designed to protect people from stereotypes and assumptions about what they can do based on their disabilities. And what should be happening is that they're being judged based on their ability and on what their doctor says they can do or not do. So I think that, something that I like people to think about is there's such a thing as benevolent discrimination. It's a term I've heard, and I think that there can be this paternalistic sort of approach to employees like, oh, you take time off, don't bother, it's okay, we'll take care of this. That's nice. But if you want to work while you're getting treatment and if your doctor says, sure, you can work, you can still work for full time, that's what's important. So no one should be pushing you to go on leave. Nobody should be, not giving you assignments thinking you're not up to it. That's your call. That's your call and your doctor's call. So, being aware of, are they not giving me an important assignment because they think I'm not going to have enough energy to do it, when in fact I think I'll be just fine? Are they pushing me to go out on leave? Those kinds of things. So that's something to be aware of, and could potentially be, a red flag that you're being judged based on an illegal reason, which is an assumption about what you can do because you're sick or because you're being treated for something. There could be different reactions to male and female medical conditions. So ovarian cancer or uterine cancer clearly is a disease for women, or people who identify as women, and are men being treated differently who have back issues or prostate cancer? That seems kind of subtle. It could be happening, but certainly there's enough of a gender parity between the condition and sex that there could be something going on, but just to be aware of it in the workplace. Requesting excessive amounts of information about your condition, wanting to get access to your records, wanting to talk to your doctor. I mean, those things are just suspicious, especially if you've given them enough information to approve or not approve your request for reasonable accommodations. So pushing back on your doctor's recommendations, I've had this happen with clients quite a bit, where maybe they're ready to come back from leave and the employer says, no, you're not ready yet. Well, I am. My doctor says I can come back. I just need maybe a few things to help me when I'm back at work. Refusing to provide you with reasonable accommodations, even though they don't pose an undue hardship. And again, I talked about that a little bit earlier, but undue hardship is significant difficulty or expense. It is not, that's inconvenient, we don't want to do that, that's hard. It needs to be significant. That's a high burden. And I'm amazed at how many times employers will just not even bring that into the calculus. It's, oh, well, that's not feasible. Well, why? What is it about it that makes it an undue hardship? The onus really is on them to articulate why they can't provide you with something. And if they provide you with an alternative accommodation that accomplishes the same thing, that's fine. But if they're just saying, no, you can't have that without any explanation, that's highly suspect and potentially a red flag. So you're getting treatment, and assessing, has your need for accommodations changed? Chemo, I have never gone through it myself, but I hear it has all sorts of horrible side effects. Chemo brain, being able to, having trouble concentrating, having trouble with cognitive, functioning generally. That is absolutely something that happens. You can have temperature sensitivity issues. I mean, things that when you're not at home, you can't maybe make easy adjustments to. So if you have additional needs, you can absolutely revisit the conversation about reasonable accommodations. That, again, that's why it's an interactive process, because sometimes your needs change, or maybe you don't need an accommodation that you already had anymore, but there's something else that could be helpful. This website towards the bottom of the slide is from the JAN website. One of the really great things about that website, in addition to the other accolades I've kind of poured on them, is that they provide ideas for accommodations, either by whatever the job kind of function is, or by the medical condition. So they have a whole list of ideas for reasonable accommodations for cancer. And a lot of it is based on the side effects you may have from treatment. So, decreased stamina or fatigue issues. Maybe you need a flexible schedule where you have a break in the middle of the day and you can just take a nap. Being able to work from remotely so that you can accomplish that. Um, Having a temporary part-time schedule. If you took leave to maybe get surgery and you're coming back, have a week where you're only working 4 hours a day, and then have a week when you're working 6 hours a day, and then work your way back up to 8 or whatever you were working before. Um, Executive functioning deficits. I know a lot of clients who've had, TBIs or maybe who've had chemo and the lingering effects of it, who really need things in writing. And that can be tough when you work in either a small environment or maybe a less formal one where you might see your boss in the hallway and they say, hey, can you do that thing? And then you're sitting down at your desk and you've forgotten what it is already. So maybe the accommodation is, hey, if you give me an assignment, can you please, follow up with me with an email? If you give it to me orally, can you just shoot me a quick email so that I know, what it is and I make sure that I've got it? Maybe you have some sort of meeting with your boss once a week to talk about what's on your plate and what you're working on and the timeline for, how long you have to get it done. That's where the creativity, I think, is really important. So it could be that maybe that's never an accommodation that's been requested before from your employer, but it could be really helpful to you. It's going to help you get your job done. And it'll help your supervisors because they're going to get the content or the product from you that they're looking for. So those are the kinds of things that can be an accommodation, even if we don't think about that traditionally as one. Having a suppressed immune system. I think COVID has obviously made this really clear. If you're concerned about going back into your workplace and people have been working remote and now your employer is starting to bring folks back, if your doctor is advising you you're immunosuppressed, I don't want you working with however many people are in your office, work from home, continued work from home is an accommodation. And there's a legitimate reason why you should not be around a whole bunch of people, especially if they're not wearing masks. They should be. I mean, those are the rules right now in Colorado and certainly in Denver where I am. Unless you're working alone in your office, people are supposed to be wearing masks. But if there's a concern about people are not wearing PPE, if there's too many people at work, or you just don't want to be there at all and your doctor supports that, then continued work from home is absolutely an accommodation. The nuance there is, can you do your essential functions from home? So if you're, a PA or a nurse, that's going to be tough unless there's some, job they can put you in where you can be answering phone calls or doing telemedicine. Otherwise, that's going to be where the rubber hits the road. Can you do your job? Can you do the essential functions of your job from home? But certainly, being concerned about being exposed um, to COVID and to just people's germs, which certainly that concern existed even before the pandemic, that's a legitimate reason to ask for an accommodation like working from home, or maybe having an office space that's moved somewhere else where maybe you're a little bit further removed from people at your workspace or at your workplace. And again, that's where creativity can be helpful. And again, this is the website for some other ideas. If you're continuing the interactive process, like I said earlier, you don't have to put this stuff in writing. It can be just sitting down with the same person who you talked to originally. But if you're, really trying to make sure you document everything, if things are starting to go a little bit awry, put it in writing. Hey, I've been experiencing some additional symptoms. I think I need more accommodations. Can we meet and talk about it? Here's what I have in mind. I'm happy to hear what you have to say, and then just kind of keep the process going. There may be a point where the symptoms you're experiencing are just so onerous that you don't think you can work anymore, or you don't want to work, frankly, and you want to give yourself the space to recover. So it may be that it's time to take a leave of absence if your doctor supports it, and you're going to be able to get the time that you need. And the question to ask is, can I do my job? And if not, maybe is there a temporary reassignment that I can be given? So for instance, the example of someone who's maybe a nurse working in a clinic, can you be doing telemedicine? Can you be doing, phone calls, maybe to help people with medical questions or who have prescription requests or something? Your employer is not obligated to create a position for you, but if one exists that they could kind of plug you into, even if temporarily, that's a reasonable accommodation, but they may not be able to do that. And in that case, they may lean on, listen, it's time for you to, go on leave if you can't do the essential functions of your job, and we don't have a different position to offer you in the interim. You can request a leave of absence as an accommodation under the ADA or CADA or the Rehab Act. If you're lucky enough to work at an employer who has 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius, you're going to be covered by the Family Medical Leave Act. That gets you the um, glorious outcome of 12 weeks of unpaid leave. I mean, that's not great, but it is protected leave. So while you're on leave, whether it's intermittent, kind of here and there, taking, every Friday off or maybe the day after chemo off, or if it's a block leave, which is when you're taking off several weeks consecutively, you're going to be able to come back to your job, and your employer has to give you either your old job back or one that's essentially similar and has the same benefits. There is actually going to be a Colorado law that passed. Voters voted on it in November, and so we're going to have a Colorado state level paid leave that's going to cover people who work for employers that are smaller, but it's not active yet. The Department of Labor at the Colorado level need to establish rules for it. They need to establish a way for people to pay into it. So it's just not, it's exciting, but it's not something that we're going to be able to take advantage of for the next probably couple of years. I think it's effective in 2023, but I need to double check. So that's not going to be helpful for anybody here in the next year or two or three. So that's, there's more information on the FMLA at the bottom of this slide. But again, even if you're not covered by the FMLA, you can absolutely request an accommodation of leave. It just may be unpaid, and your employer may require you to first use your accrued leave. So if you've got, vacation pay or PTO, they may require you to use that first, which is a bummer because then you come back without having any paid leave left. But they are allowed to do that, to have you first use that accrued paid time off and then to have you come back. So, oops, I think I went the wrong way here. Here we go. So when you're on leave, if you're not lucky enough to have a ton of banked PTO, you may be able to rely on a short-term disability policy, something that's offered through your employer, or maybe you were smart enough to purchase it on your own privately. That'll typically pay anywhere from 40 to 60% of your salary while you're on leave, and it can last from 3 to 6 months. Totally depends on the plan. And most of the time it requires that you can't do your job, so your particular occupation, because of the medical condition that you have and the symptoms that you're experiencing as a result. There's also the option of Social Security disability insurance. If you have this particular diagnosis of ovarian cancer, it's virtually automatic. It's called a compassionate allowance, and you can apply for it, and you apply for all this stuff online. Otherwise, you apply and you have to wait for a few months, and don't be discouraged. Sometimes you do get denied initially, and it's worth appealing. This is not my area, so I'll warn you that SSDI is not something that I do, but it is an option if you feel like you're going to be out of work and you can't do any job at all. So it's not just your particular job, but I just can't work because of the symptoms that I'm having. So other red flags, I should say that these are cumulative. So any of the red flags that I identified earlier could be happening, but then there are these additional ones. This insisting that you go out on leave when you can work, when you and your doctor both say, hey, she's going to be a little tired and maybe she should have the day or two after chemo off, but other than that she can work as long as she wants. If your employer is insisting that you go on leave, and that's not consistent with what you or your doctor are saying, that's concerning, because they have virtually no basis other than just, I'm concerned you can't work. Well, you can be concerned all you want, but my doctor and I say I can, and so that's reality. Pushing back on your doctor's recommendations, especially if they say you can come back to work or that you do need to go on leave, that's concerning. Or just expressing irritation. Maybe you're being high maintenance because here you are back again requesting more accommodations. Just because you get one accommodation, let's say you get leave for a couple of weeks, your employer's not done. It's not, interactive process over, I'm all set. It's ongoing, and if things change, your employer is obligated to continue to talk to you about what you need and give it to you unless it's an undue hardship. So you get treatment. Let's say you have, you go into recovery, you have a recurrence, or maybe, you have a record of cancer, which you will for the rest of your life. The question is, are you being treated differently at your work? So even if you've never had a recurrence, you're going to be continued to be protected by these laws just because you have a history of a disability. And I think this comes up when folks are hired at new jobs. There may be a resistance to disclosing that you ever had cancer because you wonder, well, are they not going to hire you because they think you're going to have a recurrence, or they think you're going to make their health plan more expensive? I mean, all the things that people that kind of go through people's minds. So I don't blame people for not disclosing that information, because there may be a concern it's going to be, you know, used against you, or you're going to be judged negatively as a result. Um, so that's why I say, you know, when you're applying for a new job, be cautious about disclosing your previous diagnoses, because you just don't know what people think or what they're going to think. If you're working at the same position, you know, if you had treatment, you know, you were working somewhere, you had treatment there, you're back, things are going well, you know, how are you being treated now? Is there a change? You know, sometimes with clients I've had, you know, things have been going fine for them, then they get a disability, they get treated for it, they're good. If it's cancer, especially, they're in, you know, remission. And then all of a sudden, you know, they're not getting raises, they're not getting promotions, their growth at the company is being, you know, stymied. And there seems to be no other real explanation for that other than, well, you know, we're worried that you're going to get cancer again, and we don't want to get too attached to you, or we don't want you to, you know, go out on leave again and leave us all in a lurch, kind of that guilt. So that's concerning. I think it's very rare that people articulate that sort of thing. I'm amazed that they do sometimes, but mostly it's really just the circumstantial evidence of it. Things were fine. You were being, you know, given promotions and good reviews. You get sick. They find, you know, your employer finds out you have a disability of some kind. Then after that, all of a sudden you're, you know, a persona non grata. You're getting looked over. That sort of trend is what's very, very notable. Caregivers. I don't know if there's anybody on the Zoom call who's a caregiver, but certainly, you know, feel free to disseminate this information to, you know, spouses and friends and people who, you know, take time off to bring you to appointments and care for you. They have legal rights also. The FMLA, the same law that gives you leave because you have your own serious health condition, it also gives people the right to for time off to take care of a family member. The one kind of downside is that family member is pretty narrowly construed. So my mother-in-law is a mother to me. She's not a family member under the FMLA, sadly. It would only be a biological or a natural parent, a spouse, and then children. The ADA actually has an association discrimination component. So if you know your employer can't basically treat you differently because you have an association with someone with a disability. So this covers people who, you know, they don't have to be family members. This can be, you know, you have a really close friend who's going through, you know, who was just diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and you're her go-to to bring her to appointments and to, you know, be at home with her after chemo to help care for her. You have time, you have the ability to, you know, help take care of that person and not be treated differently as a result. You don't have the right to an accommodation, like I need, you know, this number of days off a month to help care for this person, but you do have a right to not be treated differently as a result of that. Some other place where this might come about is something that we call family responsibilities discrimination. So there are these persisting stereotypes that, you know, women with caregiving responsibilities are just going to be less committed. You know, women who are mothers are just not going to, you know, give the same amount of time as women who don't have kids, or men who, you know, do but have a woman to take care of their kids. Men don't need time off because they don't take care of people, which is, you know, and all of these are ridiculous, but they're persistent, and certainly some employers do make they are attached to these stereotypes, and they make assumptions based on them. So, you know, being aware of whether any of those persisting stereotypes are going on in the background and they reflect how you're being treated at work. Really the easiest way to prove that, or to at least have some idea that it's going on, is to look at how other people are being treated. I think that's more difficult now that a lot of us are working remotely. You just can't really see what's happening. But if, you know, somebody takes off time to, you know, go to their kid's baseball game, you want to take time off to take your friend to a doctor's appointment, and that person gets the time off but you don't, that's interesting and strange, and worth noting. So you know, since we've just got a few minutes left, I'll go real quickly through my thoughts on when red flags do arise. What do you do? And then we can, you know, chat if anybody's got questions. It's been very quiet. So if, any of these red flags arise, keep documentation. So, who said it, when, what day, print out emails if they're, you know, remotely concerning. Check your employee handbook. If it rises to a point where you're concerned that your accommodations are either not being granted with, not a very good reason, or maybe they're being ignored, or you're being treated differently because of the accommodations that you've requested, or because you've disclosed that you have this condition, there may be a complaint process at work for reporting discrimination. Now, I think a lot of times, I don't know how helpful that process is, because it's typically going to the same people who maybe are making decisions about whether you get accommodations in the first place, but I think it's still worth doing if there's an internal process. You can contact Jan, and this is certainly not in an order that you must follow. So that could be the first thing you do, is call up Jan and say, hey, I'm having this kind of weird issue at work. What do you think? And I've had clients, spend a lot of time on the phone with these people, and they'll, give them advice on, try sending this email. They're not giving you legal advice, but they're at least giving you some pointers on, things you can be putting in writing, other things you might try. I've had some clients who have particularly clueless employers. Maybe there's no HR, or there's, one HR person who's rather green, who, the client will go to the Jan website, print off a brochure about cancer and like the fact that it's a disability, and it has a list of suggested accommodations, and just give a copy of it to HR or email it. I mean, that's perfectly helpful and quite handy. If you really feel like this just doesn't feel good, I don't like what's going on, contact an attorney. I've talked to several women who've gotten my name through COCA. I'm happy to talk to you if you've got questions, and if you're not quite sure if things have risen to the point where you should get an attorney involved, but you're kind of on edge, things just don't feel right. Contact an attorney. You can always file a charge of discrimination with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or the Colorado Civil Rights Division. The Colorado Civil Rights Division would be the place that you go if you work for a small employer, so one that's fewer than 15 employees. The EEOC you can go to as long as you have an employer over 15 employees. You've got 300 days for the EEOC since the kind of action that happened that you believe is discriminatory, whether it's not getting your accommodations, getting terminated, not getting a promotion, something like that. The Civil Rights Division, you have 6 months, so it's obviously a shorter fuse. And before you do either of those things, I think it's usually a good idea to talk to an attorney just to make sure that you've covered all your bases. And then this is my information. Feel free to contact me. If you miss it, Patrice can always, get my information over to you. But that's my presentation. And I'm happy to answer questions if anybody's got them. Or just chat more about other areas.
Well, I just want to jump in and say thank you so much, Ariel. That was so compelling and good. And man, you were moving quick, but that's a lot of information. So I'll let everybody know that that we recorded this, and if you wanted to watch it again, I'll absolutely get you the link, and it's going to end up on our video resources as well on site. But and if you joined us since I made this announcement, we're just going to be real casual about, you can just unmute and ask Ariel a question, since it's a small enough group that you don't have to do anything formal like submit it to chat. So does anybody have anything that they would like to run up the flagpole with Miss Ariel?
I have a question. So one of the things you didn't describe was when you're post-treatment. My last infusion was October 6th. I was diagnosed. My first infusion was June 15th. Let me backtrack. I worked for the city of Aurora at the time, and I had to advocate for myself to find out through this employer I've had for 20 years, all the benefits that were made available to me.
Yeah.
And long-term disability was a benefit everybody got, but I never thought to think, you don't realize what you don't have until you have need for it, right? And so my supervisor didn't tell me about it. I had to dig through HR, and it was a surprise. Wow, I have it.
Yeah.
And so I went straight from FMLA to long-term disability. So I was approved, and I'm going through a redetermination now. And what they're doing is I'm no longer with that employer because I've since moved out of state.
Mm-hmm.
But with this long-term disability, they're requiring that I also apply for Social Security disability in order for my benefits to continue with them. So that's the norm. Is that usually how that works?
Yes, yes. And, I should say it totally depends on the plan. I'm glad you were able to take that one with you, because sometimes long-term disability plans are kind of linked to an employer. So that's a great plan
Right.
we're able to take, and good for you for self-advocating. I can't tell you how often that situation comes up where, maybe your supervisor just has no clue and HR doesn't, whatever. But it is pretty common for, if you're on long-term disability for some period of time, for them to basically have the incentive to pay you less. So if they can get it offset by having the government subsidize it, great, that works for them. So it's required that, you'll need to apply for SSDI. If you don't get it, that's okay. It's not, you're not obligated to do absolutely everything under the sun to make sure you're approved. But they do want to take advantage of the opportunity to no longer have to pay you some portion of that. And that's, insurance companies making bank. So
Right. Yes.
I just want to add just one little thing, and it's not, detail packed like this presentation has been, but we do have a little video on the COCA video resources of one of our local survivors who does a little bit on SSDI, and just to make sure that everybody takes advantage of it, that you are paying into it, you can go on and off of it. It's not a forever thing if you don't need it to be, but she was running a medical practice, or is still. And, while she was in treatment, applied, got it, and then eventually it gets, recalibrated. So just, I think it'd be great if there was a single person that could help us advocate on all the different benefits. Like you were saying, Joyce, you didn't even know what you had access to, but
yeah.
There is that, just FYI.
Yeah, but I'd say that's a great resource, but I'd say that is normal. And some disability carriers will even get you an attorney to help you get it because they're that vested.
And they're doing that. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Because they really want you to get it, so they don't have to, it's an offset. They don't have to pay that to you.
Well, Ariel, earlier you said when you apply, you can't work. You're unable to do any work if you're making that application for SSDI. And right now, my doctor does have me. She has issued a no work right now, and so I know soon, hopefully that's going to be released to part-time work. And so I went into a long conversation yesterday with Voya, who is my long-term disability provider. And it's a little confusing. There's so much. And so Patrice, yes, if there's a day ahead, that would really be helpful, because just to understand and navigate, unless you know to ask the questions, they really aren't forthcoming with information. And so anyway, it's been educational.
Yeah. And certainly, in a firm that I used to work for, we also did, we helped people with appeals with long-term and short-term disability. So that's a whole other area of law, but one, I don't still do it, but I know people who do it, so I can provide referrals. But if you get turned down, if there comes a point where, you get denied continuing long-term disability, and it doesn't seem right that happened, and it's certainly inconsistent with what your doctor says, it may be worth appealing. And sometimes it's worth having an attorney help you because it's so complicated. That's where you're looking at, ERISA laws and stuff that makes my toes kind of curl. So it's complicated, but it's worth not giving up. And you don't seem like the type of person who gives up easily. So that's good. Fortitude is very helpful in this area.
Yes.
I have a quick question, Ariel.
Yeah.
Am I under any legal obligation to disclose my cancer to a potential employer?
No, the only
Okay,
thing,
that's what I thought. Okay.
yeah, the only thing that they can ask you, and again, employers shouldn't do lots of things they do anyway. So, so what? I mean, there's no police that comes in and tells them you can't ask that question. But the one thing they could ask you in a, interview, or as you're getting geared up to apply or to work somewhere, is, do you need any accommodations? They can ask you that.
Okay.
And that, certainly depending on the accommodation could lend itself to, oh, well, I think I kind of know what medical condition they have, but they're not allowed to ask you what you have, what condition you have. And you have absolutely no obligation to disclose your disability, nor do you have, any obligation to disclose it if you think you will need an accommodation. You don't have to tell them that you need one. And some people may think, oh, that's a bait and switch. You're trying to get hired, and then when you start working there, then you ask for a stand-up desk or an ergonomic assessment or whatever. But that's okay. It's not a bait and switch. You are not obligated to disclose that until you are an employee. And then at that point, it's just if you need an accommodation.
Good to know. Makes perfect sense. Thanks.
Sure.
And just to go back, what you said earlier, Ariel, is if we don't tell them, then we have no benefit of the law of the ADA.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
Unless,
So the catch-22.
it really is. Because, I've had folks come in and say, oh, well, I got fired, but hey, I have type 2 diabetes. I'm like, well, did they know you did? Because if they didn't know, then you can't possibly logically kind of match the decision with the fact that you had a disability. So there's that component. And then you also don't get to avail yourself of your right to reasonable accommodations unless they know you need them. And it's really tough. I don't envy people who have to make that disclosure, because there is an inherent, nakedness in it, that you're admitting that you need help when, you maybe don't, you hope you don't, but you may.
Well, and I thought it was really interesting when you talked about what did you call it? The benevolent discrimination.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a really good focusing on, excluding you from opportunities because assuming about your abilities. So I thought that was a really good heads up.
Yeah. And I think, people really can have the best of intentions, but, there has to be a step back and thinking, are you making this determination based on what this person can do and what their doctor says they can do? Or are you assuming that, oh, well, because they're in treatment, we really should lighten their load, or they should go on leave? And, and there's I think people can tell the difference between, hey, as a friend or as somebody who cares about you, I think you're working too hard. You really should take some time off to heal. That's fine, but that's different from, no, you can't come back, or you must go on leave, even if that's against your desire and what your doctor says you can do.
All right. Well,
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and guidance, and it's always so helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure. My pleasure. And feel free, if you have other questions, feel free to be in touch. I'm happy to help.
Thanks. And it was really meaningful. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ariel.
Good. Lovely to chat with all of you. Best of luck. We'll talk to you soon. Bye, Patrice.
Bye.